Can the Lord's Supper be taken anytime? Can the Lord's Supper be taken anywhere? Can we observe the Lord's Supper on a Christmas Eve service or on Easter or on Thanksgiving? If someone gets married, should we partake of the Lord's Supper at that time to somehow bless the union? These are good questions. They're questions that we need to answer. They're questions that we need to know the answers to, because these are all questions that come up among religious people. These people are exactly like Paul mentioning to the saints in Rome of his Jewish brethren that had a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge, Romans chapter 10. So what we need to do is we need to go to God's word to answer this question. So my first point, obviously, is just that. Anytime that we have a question about religion, we must go to the source to answer it. We must go to God's word. We emphasize in these videos all the time that my opinion or your opinion does not matter. It doesn't matter what we've always believed, what we've been taught, what our parents taught us, what our grandparents taught us. What matters is what God says on the matter, okay? So 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, God's word gives us everything we need. It makes us completely, totally complete for everything that we could require in matters of religion. So we are going to be judged by the words of Jesus, so we've got to go to the words of Jesus, John 12:48, okay? So point one, the Bible is the only authority. Point two, the Bible authorizes that the Lord's Supper was only taken on a very specific day. The Bible authorizes by approved example that the church, under the direct oversight of inspired apostles, partook of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. In Acts 2 and verse 42, the day of Pentecost, that day, that 50 days after the Passover, the birth of the church, they observed the Lord's Supper. They remembered his death in that worship context as that church came together on the day of its inception. In Acts 2 and verse 42, they broke bread in a worship context. They continued in the apostles' doctrine and in fellowship, that is giving, and in the breaking of bread and prayer. So they worshiped together on the first day of the week. They did so in a worship assembly. In Acts 20 verse 7, you have the same thing, that Paul waited a whole week to meet with the saints so that he could worship with them. And in that worship context, they partook of the Lord's Supper. You can see in 1 Corinthians 16 that as Paul writes to Corinth regarding giving, that on the first day of the week, they all were meeting together. They would meet on the first day of every week. And in this worship context, they would partake of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. So point one, God's word is the authority. Point two, the Bible authorizes by approved example that the Lord's Supper was only ever taken of approvedly on the first day of the week. Point three, the Bible authorizes the Lord's Supper to consist of two elements. Unleavened bread. You can see in Matthew 26:17 that as Jesus was preparing to eat the Passover, that these were the days of unleavened bread. And again, in verse number 26, he would take this bread and say, "Take, eat, this is my body." And that is that it is a symbol of his body. So the Lord's Supper, the proper elements are unleavened bread. And then you have the fruit of the vine. You can see this in Matthew 26, verses 27 through 29. He's the cup that he distributed to his disciples to drink. In it was the fruit of the vine. That is what we call grape juice. So the Lord's Supper consisted of unleavened bread and fruit of the vine. There is no authority for me to change these things. I can't do Dr. Pepper and Doritos because I like Dr. Pepper and Doritos. I can't do any other snack food or anything you can think of because I like it. That isn't it at all. We have to go by what God says. So point one, God's word is the standard. Point two, the Bible authorizes the Lord's Supper to be taken on the first day of the week. Point three, the Bible authorizes the elements of the Lord's Supper to be unleavened bread and fruit of the vine, period. All right. Point four, the Bible authorizes the Lord's Supper to be taken by the saints in a worship assembly. I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and I want you to notice four phrases in this context, four phrases in essentially 16 verses that Paul uses to emphasize something. Ready? 1 Corinthians 11 verse 17, when you come together. 1 Corinthians 11 verse 18, when you come together in the church. 1 Corinthians 11 verse 20, when you come together in one place. And in 1 Corinthians 11 verse 33, when you come together to eat, that is, partake of the Lord's Supper. Notice the emphasis that Paul puts on these saints being together in one place. They were together as a church, as a congregation, and they were there on the first day of the week to worship God together. In this context, the Lord's Supper is authorized to be taken. It is not authorized to be taken outside of a worship assembly. It is not authorized to be taken out to some guy in the parking lot as he's late for service and then he's going to the beach. That isn't taking the Lord's Supper. It can't be removed from the context of a worship assembly any more than you could substitute Doritos and Dr. Pepper. It can't be taken out of the context of the worship assembly any more than you could take it on a Tuesday afternoon or Christmas Eve party. The Bible is the sole authority for all that we do and say in matters of religion, Colossians 3:17. Jesus wants us to be a living sacrifice and to prove the acceptable will of God. Romans 12, verse 2, and you can see that in other texts also, Ephesians 5:10 and 1 Thessalonians 5:21. There is no authority for taking the Lord's Supper outside of the worship assembly. There is no authority for taking the Lord's Supper on any day other than the first day of the week. And there is no authority for using elements in the Lord's Supper other than unleavened bread and fruit of the vine, which God specified. Do you disagree with us? That's okay. We want you to study with us further if you disagree. Why don't you send us an email at freeportcoc@gmail.com? Why don't you comment on our Facebook post or perhaps comment on our videos on YouTube? We would love to discuss it with you. If we can answer a question for you, if you have something you want us to discuss, please email us and we will put it in the rotation and we will discuss it. Thank you very much for watching and we hope you have a wonderful day.